Listen, just wanted to say thank you so much to the ministers for being here today. And I know it's been a very, very difficult time for all of us. And I know that you care deeply about the people of this country and the Indigenous people of this country. And, I just want to say we're all in this together, and we need to make things better for for the Indigenous people of Canada from coast to coast to coast. So, Minister Bennett, with respect to the co-development of a national action plan in response to the issues that are identified in the final report for the calls for, justice for the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, will the investment of $6 million, is that like for a single year, or is it going to be ongoing funding? Is there going to be ongoing funding to support that process?
That is, I'm very pleased to report that will be for the ongoing for the next 5 years, in that we really do believe that in order to have a national action plan that is accountable for results, that we will have to be measuring and adapting the plan. We had always said it would be evergreenable, but working with our partners and the families and the survivors, the necessity of being able to update the plan regularly based on getting results is what the major part of that investment will be.
Thank you. And so how do you propose to go forward, or is this part of what we're actually waiting for now? So how are the families going to be involved as we move forward? I know I have one woman here, Tanya Brooks, who is a missing and murdered woman, and we walk every year in her honor, and the family lives here in Millbrook First Nation. So what do you suggest is the best way moving forward?
Well, I think that what a number of the families and survivors have said is that they also want to have an ability to influence their local the jurisdictions plan. So as each of the provinces and territories will have their own chapter and their own plan, as we were inspired by the local, the plan for the Yukon Territory, the First Nations, the families, the Women's Circle, together with the government, have developed a very impressive plan, and that we will be seeing that again in Nova Scotia, the families will be included, I think, coast to coast to coast, but also the organizations like Pautudik, the Michif Women, NWAC, all of those organizations will be also involving families as we go forward, and certainly this investment will make sure that families are able to help us improve the plan as we go forward over the next 5 years.
Thank you, Minister. So to get to the nitty-gritty and the bottom of racism that is at the root of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, I mean, we have to take a look at the fact that it's about partly respect, that women, for one thing, are not seeming to be respected as equal citizens in the eyes of some men, and then you add on somebody who is racialized, and it's even more difficult for them. And anybody who's ever gone through a sexual assault of any sort, which many of us unfortunately have, know what it's like to be just an object and not actually thought of as a human being. What are your thoughts about what we can do as a government and as individuals and as members of parliament to be able to change that old-fashioned and really just despicable mentality?
I think, as we've seen over these recent weeks, but validating what Indigenous people have been experiencing in their lived experience forever, that this is something that has to be examined in each of us and in every institution in Canada. Certainly, when we began the pre-inquiry, to actually hear about the sexism and racism, not only in what they experienced in policing or in the justice system, but as you say, in a hospital or after a sexual assault, in education, in post-secondary, that this is everywhere.
Or even walking along the street.
and walking along the street. But, one of the things that really struck me at that time was to have a family with a daughter who's missing. If it got accidentally reported that the daughter was Caucasian, that the family would feel that they shouldn't correct it because they felt that the search would be less, it would be, oh shit, it's inevitable, but also the quality of the investigation, the charges that are laid, the plea bargaining, the sentencing, everything seemed to be different to the families if it was an Indigenous person that had been missing or ended up found murdered. And so I think that's that is their lived experience.
Right.
We're at time right there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Minister. I really appreciate that.
Ready to go. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Chair. And thanks again, everybody, for all of your questions. Really good and respectful questions on the committee, and also very interesting answers from the ministers. I really appreciate it. So I want to talk again about self-governance. And we know that when Indigenous communities move towards self-governance and self-determination, that they really have better outcomes right across the board. Jaime can tell us that with education, for instance, and also with healthcare. And one would imagine with policing, if we can go in that direction and prevent all these terrible atrocities that are really happening, too, in New Brunswick, just in the last while, where health wellness checks, where people were ended up with 5 bullets in them or 2 bullets in them. It's just terrible. So my question involves the $24 million that was allocated to the band support program in the supplementary estimates. That was to help First Nations move towards self-determination. Do you know yet, any of the ministers, how that's being used? And what else do we need to do to help First Nations people and communities move towards self-determination? If perhaps all 3 of you could give a quick answer, I'd really, really appreciate hearing from all 3 of you. Carolyn, do you want to go first? Minister Bennett?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think that we, as both Minister Miller and Minister Blair have the mandate now to move on First Nations policing. We have seen what has happened in Yukon, and we've seen the results when you have a more community-based approach. And I think that the kind of legislation that Minister Blair has committed to bringing in is the kind of legislation that changes it from just a program where we know over the years, even those with First Nations policing have worried every March whether the money would be there again or whether they'd be laying people up. So to move it to a statutory funding as an essential service will make a big difference in people having the confidence to go forward with designing, whether it's in their community or as a treaty group or as a regional force, to be able to do the things they know work well.
Thank you. Minister Van Dal?
Yes, that's a great question. And I think just generally, and I don't have a lot of detailed information on the initiatives Minister Blair is moving forward on, but I think just philosophically, self-determination and letting Indigenous nations take care of their own governance and just taking care of their own communities, whether it's child and family services, whether it's policing, whether it's health. I mean, that basic philosophy, I think, is going to bring many more positive returns than what we've been doing thus far. So it's time for a change.
Thank you. Minister Miller?
Yeah, and as an equally overarching comment, I would say one of the observations, at least, that I've had in the small time I've had the honor to serve as Indigenous Services Minister is at some point you realize that the pace has to be dictated by Indigenous communities and not the reverse. And that means we talk on their terms, according to their priorities, and realize that there's not a one-size-fits-all, which is so self-evident. But you may go into a particular community and say this framework that we've proposed works perfectly. You may go into a different part of the country and say, no, we have a treaty basis and we would like to proceed along those terms. Or in a different part of the country where this gets rejected entirely and there's a different nature of discussion. This is something that self-evident to the communities you're discussing, but perhaps not to a number of well-meaning non-Indigenous people, including I would say myself a couple of years ago for sure. This is it's a long process. It is indeed sometimes frustrating, but it's something that I think this government's been dedicated to doing its best to get right. And it's something that requires patience. It requires dialogue, first and foremost, but also recognizing that those pillars that I mentioned in a response to Adam are so key in supporting, and they are pillars to identity and self-governance and nationhood that we take for granted, but are very important in fostering and continuing to foster in the right way.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Brings us